In June of 1988, in the rolling hills of Ashtabula County, Ohio, the Thistles had won. The victory was not a sudden conquest, but a slow, creeping occupation that had taken the better part of a decade. It was most complete on the North 40, a parcel of land belonging to Arthur Croft, a man who had seen 71 summers on that very farm. The field, once a reliable source of timothy and clover hay, was now a 40-acre declaration of the Canada Thistle's sovereignty. From the county road, it looked like a solid thing, a textured blanket of silver-green leaves, and, in the early summer light, the first violet blossoms that promised a fresh legion of wind-borne seeds. Arthur Croft stood at the edge of it, his hands resting on the top strand of a woven wire fence that had been stretched and stapled into place by his own father in 1948. The wire was still tight. The locust posts, cut from their own woodlet, were still sound. Only the land inside the fence had failed. Arthur was a man shaped by the land he worked. He was not tall, but his shoulders were broad, and his frame was solid, rooted. His face was a map of sun and wind, with lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into the Ohio sky, judging the likelihood of rain or the ripeness of a crop. His hands, though knobbed with arthritis at the knuckles, were steady. They were hands that knew the feel of a worn hickory handle, the heft of a greasy bolt, the specific warmth of a newborn calf. The problem was not merely aesthetic, nor was it a simple matter of lost production. It was a crisis of ecology and economics, a creeping bankruptcy measured in acres. The Canada thistle, Cirsium arvens, was not a native plant, but an aggressive interloper from Eurasia, and it fought with a tenacity that modern agriculture struggled to match. Its root system was its genius. A single plant could send out horizontal roots, rhizomes, that traveled for 10 or 20 feet before sending up a new stalk. A patch that looked like 1,000 individual plants was often a single, interconnected organism, a subterranean fortress that could withstand mowing, tilling, and even the chemical assaults that were supposed to be the final word in such conflicts. Mowing only angered it, encouraging the roots to spread further. Tilling chopped the rhizomes into smaller pieces, each one capable of becoming a new, independent plant. It was a monster that regenerated from its own wounds. The history of the failure on the North 40 was well known in the local community, a cautionary tale told over coffee at the diner or while leaning against a pickup truck at the feed co-op. The previous owner, a man named Miller who had bought the farm on speculation in the late 70s, had tried to fight it with chemistry. He had drenched the field in 2,4-D and later, when that proved insufficient, with more potent and expensive concoctions containing dicamba. The chemicals would knock the thistles back for a few weeks, turning the vibrant green to a sickly yellow, but the roots endured. They waited in the dark soil, drawing on reserves of energy, and then sent up new shoots with a vengeance. Miller's war had been costly and ultimately futile. He had poisoned the soil, killed off the beneficial broadleaf plants like clover, and weakened the grasses, creating a perfect, competition-free environment for the thistles to reclaim. When the agricultural economy turned sour in the early 80s, Miller had defaulted, and Arthur Croft, who held the second mortgage, had taken back the 40 acres that had been carved off his family's original homestead. He had reacquired the land, but he had also inherited its intractable problem. For 5 years, Arthur had managed the infestation. He did not spray. He mowed strategically before the plants went to seed, try to deplete the roots' energy reserves. But it was a losing battle. Mowing at that scale cost fuel and time, and for every stalk he cut, it seemed 2 more emerged from the sprawling underground network. The community watched. They saw the purple haze thicken each summer. They saw the pasture become less a field and more a wilderness. They saw it as a sign of surrender, a quiet admission that the old man was finally letting a piece of his farm go. It was a shame, they said. A good piece of bottomland lost. Dale Harding represented the modern world's answer to such problems. He was the new county extension agent, a young man in his late 20s with a fresh degree in agronomy from Ohio State University. He drove a new, county-issued Ford Ranger, and he carried a stainless steel soil probe and a clipboard with neatly printed assessment forms. He arrived at Arthur's farm on a Tuesday morning in late June, the air already thick with humidity. He wore a clean polo shirt with the university logo embroidered on the chest and a pair of work boots that had not yet lost their factory sheen. He was here to help. That was his job. Arthur met him by the barn. He had been greasing the fittings on his old New Holland haybine, a machine nearly as old as Dale himself. Arthur wiped his hands on a red rag and listened. Dale was earnest, confident, and filled with the certainty of a man who has read all the latest literature. He spoke of integrated pest management, of herbicide resistance, of application windows, and soil pH. Arthur nodded, his face betraying nothing. He led the young man to the edge of the North 40. Dale Harding stood where Arthur had stood so many times before, but he saw something different. He did not see a history of failure or a complex ecological puzzle. He saw a data set. He saw a textbook case of noxious weed infestation. He walked 20 paces into the field, the sharp spines of the thistles scratching at his jeans. He used a small tool to count the number of stalks in a square foot. He made notes on his clipboard. He spoke as he wrote. Density is extreme, he said, more to himself than to Arthur. We're looking at 20, maybe 25 stems per square foot in some places. Complete canopy closure. The grasses are suppressed to almost 0-inch, he knelt, pulling up a single thistle plant. It broke off at the soil line, a useless gesture. The rhizomatous root structure is the real issue, he explained, as if lecturing a student. What you see above ground is just the tip of the iceberg. The root biomass is probably 3 or 4 times what you're seeing up here. They walked back to the fence row. Dale leaned against the hood of his clean truck and laid out the official solution. It was a campaign of chemical warfare, meticulously planned. First, he said, pointing a pen at his notes, we need a broad-spectrum burn down. I'd recommend a tank mix of glyphosate and a dicamba formulation. We need to kill everything that's there now. We'll do that in about 2 weeks, before the seed heads mature. He looked at Arthur. It'll be expensive. For 40 acres, you're looking at a significant chemical cost, plus the custom applicator's fee. You don't have a sprayer that can handle this. Arthur remained silent. He knew his old 150-gallon sprayer, used for liquid nitrogen on his corn, was no match for this. Dale continued, warming to his subject. After the burn down, we wait. We let the roots try to regenerate. They will. About a month later, when the regrowth is 6 to 8 inches high, we hit it again, this time with a more targeted, systemic herbicide, something like cloporalid. It's designed to translocate down into the root system. That's the key. We have to kill the roots. He paused for dramatic effect. We'll probably need to do a 3rd application in the fall, before the first frost. And then, next spring, you'll still see some escape. We'll have to spot spray. In 2 years, maybe 3, we can get it back to a manageable level. Then you can reseed. But this field is out of commission for at least 2 seasons. It's a total loss for now. He clicked his pen. He looked at Arthur with a mixture of professional authority and genuine pity. This was the reality of modern farming. It was a business of inputs and outputs, and this field required a massive, costly input. He calculated the cost on a pocket calculator. He scribbled the number on his form. You're looking at about $150 an acre per year for the chemicals and the application. So, $6,000 for the first year. A little less for the second. It's a big investment, I know, but the alternative is to lose the field entirely. The weed commissioner could even declare it a noxious plot and fine you. He tore the sheet from his clipboard and handed it to Arthur. It was a prescription for a sick field, written in the language of chemistry and dollars. Arthur took the paper. He looked at the number. $6,000. It was more than he had cleared on his hay sales the entire previous year. He was debt-free. He had burned his mortgage papers 2 decades ago. He did not borrow money. He did not spend what he did not have. The number on the page was not just money. It was a philosophy, a way of farming that was alien to him. It was a solution that came from a barrel, not from the land itself. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. "Thank you for your time," he said. The words were polite, neutral. They were a dismissal. Dale Harding felt a flicker of frustration. He had laid out the science. He had presented the only viable plan. The old man's silence felt like stubbornness, like an unwillingness to accept the facts. "Mr. Croft," he said, his tone softening into one of gentle persuasion. "I know it's a lot to take in, but this isn't the 1950s anymore. These weeds have evolved. They're tougher than they used to be. The old ways of just mowing or cultivating. They just don't work on an infestation this severe. This is the only way." Arthur looked from the young man's earnest face to the field of thistles, then back again. "The old ways," he said, his voice quiet. "Sometimes they do." It was the most he had said all morning. It was not an argument. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unmovable as the bedrock beneath their feet. Dale Harding sighed, a small puff of exasperated air. He got in his truck. He had done his duty. He had offered the correct advice. If the old man chose to ignore it, that was his prerogative. As he drove away, he saw Arthur in his rearview mirror, still standing by the fence, looking at the field. He shook his head. It was a lost cause. The community, as it always did, rendered its verdict at the weekly informal court held at the Agway feed store. Arthur went in on Friday to buy a bag of mineral salt for his cattle. Bill Jensen, who farmed the section just north of Arthur, was there, along with 2 other men. They were leaning against sacks of sweet feed, their conversation a low murmur. They nodded to Arthur. He nodded back. As he waited for the clerk to fetch his salt block, he heard his own name. Dale Harding was out to see him, Bill Jensen said. Saw his truck heading down the lane. But he gave him an earful about those thistles. $6,000, another man said. That's what Dale told my brother-in-law it would take to clean up that 40. $6,000 just for the first year. Can you imagine? Arthur won't spend it, Bill said with absolute certainty. He hasn't had a loan since the Truman administration. He'll just let it go. Shame, really. My dad used to say that was the best hay ground in the county. Heard he's just going to mow it again, the third man added. Like that's ever done any good. You can't fight that stuff with a sickle bar. It's like trying to empty a lake with a teaspoon. They spoke not with malice, but with the casual, pitying certainty of men who knew how the world worked. Arthur Croft was a relic, a good man from a bygone era who simply couldn't keep up. His farm was neat, his fences were tight, his old machinery ran like a top, but he was being overrun. The thistles were a visible symbol of his obsolescence. Arthur paid for his salt block, lifted the 50-pound weight to his shoulder as if it were a loaf of bread, and walked out without a word. He had heard their judgment. He had seen it in Dale Harding's eyes. He felt the weight of their collective disbelief. It was the weight of being alone with an idea. That evening, Arthur sat on his porch swing, the chains groaning a familiar rhythm. The sun was setting, casting long shadows from the ancient maples in the yard. The air was filled with the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of his neighbor's cows. He wasn't looking at the North 40. He was looking inward, back across the decades to a time when that field was lush with clover and his father was still alive. The present crisis was not new. It was merely a larger echo of an old, familiar problem. He remembered a day in the early 1950s. He had been a young man then, full of the same kind of certainty he now saw in Dale Harding. There had been a patch of Canada thistle in the corner of that same field, near the creek. It was a small outbreak, perhaps a quarter of an acre, but it was aggressive. Arthur had wanted to attack it. He had argued for the plow, to turn it under and kill it. He had read about new chemicals in the farm journals, wondrous potions that could kill broadleaf weeds without harming the grass. His father, Thomas Croft, had listened patiently. Thomas was a man of few words, like Arthur himself. He had learned his farming not from university, but from his own father and from a lifetime of observation. He understood the farm not as a factory for producing commodities, but as a living system, a complex web of relationships between soil, water, plants, and animals. After Arthur had made his case for aggressive action, Thomas had led him to the edge of the thistle patch. He had not looked at the plants. He had looked at the soil. He had crumbled it in his fingers. Every living thing has a budget, Thomas had said. His voice was low, a rumble. It takes in energy, and it spends energy. A plant like this, its wealth is in the root. The leaves are how it earns its living, taquine in the sun. The flower and the seed, That's how it spends its inheritance on the next generation. He pointed a thick finger at the spiny leaves. You plow it. You chop up the root. You make 100 little plants, each with a bit of that wealth to get started again. You mow it. You take away its income for a while. But the root is still rich. It'll just send up new leaves. You spray it. You might poison the leaves, but the root is deep. Sometimes the poison gets all the way down. Sometimes it doesn't. And what does the poison do to the worms? To the clover? Arthur, young and impatient, had not understood. So what do? Just let it take the field. Thomas had shaken his head slowly. No, he said. You don't fight it. You don't try to kill it in one go. You make it poor. You make it spend more than it earns, season after season, until its bank is empty. You bankrupt it. He had then laid out the core principle, a piece of wisdom so simple and yet so profound that it had stayed with Arthur for 40 years. This plant protects itself with spines, his father had said. A cow won't touch it. A horse won't go near it. That's its defense. But every defense has a weakness. He pointed to the newly formed purple flower buds. That's the sweetest part of the plant, full of sugar. An animal that can get past the spines can get to the reward. And an animal that's hungry enough and smart enough will learn. There are sheep, old breeds from the Rocky Hills in Scotland, that are used to eating thorny things. They learn to nibble off the flower first. Then, once the reward is gone, if they're still hungry, they'll start on the young leaves at the top. You keep them pinned in tight on the patch. They eat the flowers, the plant tries to make more. That costs energy. They eat the leaves. The plant has to use its root reserves to grow new ones. Day after day, week after week, you're not killing the thistle. You're letting the sheep and the thistle's own ambition do the work for you. You tire it out. The memory was as clear as the evening air. It was a lesson not just in weed control, but in a way of seeing the world. It was a strategy of patience, of using the nature of the adversary against itself. It was the opposite of the chemical blitzkrieg Dale Harding had proposed. It was a quiet siege, not a frontal assault. The next morning, Arthur rose before dawn. He did not drive to the feed store or the implement dealer. He went to the old carriage house behind the main barn, a building that now served as a repository for forgotten tools and accumulated history. The air inside was cool and smelled of dust, old leather, and time. In the back corner, under a stack of old seed sacks, was a wooden chest. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside were his father's records. Thomas Croft had not been a man of letters, but he was a meticulous record keeper. There were ledgers filled with columns of dates and numbers detailing milk production, crop yields, and expenses. And there was one small, leather-bound notebook. Arthur took the notebook to the workbench and opened it under the light of a single bare bulb. The pages were yellowed. The ink faded from black to a soft brown. The handwriting was a strong, looping cursive. The notebook was his father's repository of observations, the physical manifestation of his deep, site-specific knowledge. On one page, dated 1953, he found what he was looking for. Thistle Management, North 40 Creek Bend, the heading read. Below were notes. Brought in 12 blackface ewes. Fence quarter acre with woven wire. June 10th. Sheep avoided thistles for 2 days. Grazed grass to the nub. On third day, lead ewe began eating flower heads. Others follow by evening. Move fence after 1 week. Thistles grazed down to 6 inches. Second week, regrowth was weak. By August, patch was mostly bare. So dry. Following spring, very few thistles returned. There were more notes, observations on the sheep's condition, the weather, the state of the grass. It was a scientific paper written by a farmer, its peer review conducted by the seasons themselves. It was the confirmation he needed. The knowledge was not just a memory. It was recorded fact. Arthur Croft made his decision. He did not announce it. He did not seek a second opinion or ask for permission. He acted. On Monday, he drove his 1978 Ford F-150, a truck he had bought new and maintained himself, not to the local livestock auction, but east across the Pennsylvania line into the Allegheny foothills. He was not looking for the modern, meat-producing breeds of sheep that populated most Ohio farms. He was looking for something specific, something his father had written about in the notebook. He was looking for Scottish blackface sheep. He found them on a small, hardscrabble farm run by a man almost as old as himself, a farmer who had kept the old bloodlines pure. These were not the placid, heavy-bodied sheep of the lowlands. They were lean, athletic animals with shaggy, coarse wool, long horns that curled around their ears, and an alert, intelligent look in their eyes. They looked like creatures built for survival, not for show. They were known for their hardiness, their ability to thrive on poor forage, and their instinct for browsing on a wider variety of plants than most sheep. Arthur walked among them. He watched how they moved. He looked at their teeth. He bought a flock of 60 ewes and 2 rams. The price was fair. They were not a fashionable breed. He paid in cash from a folded envelope in his pocket. The drive home was slow, the truck and trailer laboring on the hills. His tools for this endeavor were not new. They were not purchased from a catalog. They were drawn from the farm's own inventory of past solutions. For the fencing, he did not buy steel T-posts and rolls of new wire. He went to the woodlot and selected a dozen black locust trees, a wood so dense and rot-resistant that his father had called it farmer's iron. He felled the trees with his old Husqvarna chainsaw, limbed them, and dragged the logs to the barn with the John Deere 4020, his main tractor, a machine from 1969 whose diesel engine he knew by heart. He spent 3 days at a sawbuck, cutting the logs into 7-foot lengths. He sharpened the ends to a point with a draw knife, the blade peeling back the aromatic bark and white sapwood in long, satisfying curls. Each post was a piece of sculpture, functional and unique. For the fence itself, he pulled out rolls of old, used woven wire from the back of the machine shed. It was rusty but sound. He spent a day patching the few broken sections, weaving in new wire with a pair of fencing pliers, his hands performing the familiar, intricate dance. The energizer for the electric offset wire he planned to run was a German model for the 1960s, a solid-state unit in a heavy steel box that delivered a memorably potent shock with a reassuringly loud tick-tock that could be heard from 50 yards away. This was his equipment: old wood, old wire, old tractor, old sheep. It was a collection of relics, a direct contradiction to the new, shiny, and expensive solutions offered by the modern world. The process of fencing the North 40 began. It was a deliberate, methodical affair. He did not fence the entire 40 acres at once. His father's notes were specific: keep them pinned in tight. Concentration was the key. He decided to break the field into 2-acre paddocks. He would graze one paddock intensively for a week, then move the flock to the next. This rotational system would force the sheep to eat not just the grass, but the thistles, and it would give the grazed-down pasture time to recover. He started on the east side of the field, the side closest to the road. He drove the sharpened locust posts into the ground with a 10-pound maul, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump echoing across the valley. He did not use a string line. He sighted each post by eye, his years of experience a more reliable guide than any measurement. He unrolled the heavy wire, stretched it tight with the tractor and a come-along, and stapled it to the posts. Finally, he walked the entire length of the new fence, attaching the ceramic insulators and stringing the single strand of electric wire that would teach the sheep to respect their boundaries. It took him a week to build the first 2-acre enclosure. The work was hard, his muscles ached in the evenings, but it was a good, clean ache. It was the feeling of building something, not just buying something. His neighbors watched him. Bill Jensen slowed his truck as he drove by, staring at the strange sight of the old man pounding posts in the middle of a field he had seemingly abandoned. The men at the feed store, disgusted, saw Arthur Croft out there fencing his thistle patch. One would say, "What in the world for?" The consensus was that he had finally gone around the bend. He was spending his time and energy fencing a worthless piece of ground. The arrival of the sheep only confirmed their suspicions. They saw the shaggy, horned animals unloaded from the trailer. They looked nothing like the Suffolk or Dorset sheep common in the area. They looked wild. Dale Harding drove past one afternoon on his way to another farm. He saw the new fence. He saw the flock of strange-looking sheep. He pulled his truck over to the shoulder and watched for a few minutes. He saw Arthur moving a galvanized water trough. The sight was so bizarre, so contrary to every principle of modern agronomy he had been taught, that he almost laughed. Grazing sheep on a field of Canada thistle. It was madness. It was like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. He shook his head in a gesture of finality. He had offered the old man the real solution. This was just sad. It was the last futile act of a man who refused to accept that his time had passed. He put the truck in gear and drove on, dismissing the scene from his mind. It was an anomaly, an irrelevant piece of agricultural folklore playing out in the modern world. It had no bearing on the real business of farming. For the sheep, the first day in the new paddock was a festival of grass. The thistles, though dominant, had not entirely choked out the timothy and orchard grass that grew in their shade. The sheep, hungry after their journey, ignored the spiny plants and focused on the tender grasses. They fanned out across the 2 acres, their heads down, the sound of their tearing and chewing a constant, soft ripping. Arthur watched them from the fence row, his border collie, Jed, sitting patiently at his side. The dog watched the sheep, his intelligent eyes missing nothing. Arthur watched both the dog and the sheep. He was not worried. His father's notes had prepared him for this. Sheep avoided thistles for 2 days. Patience was part of the method. For 2 full days, the sheep followed the script. They ate every blade of grass they could find. They ate the few sprigs of clover that had survived Miller's chemical assaults. They grazed the paddock down to the soil, leaving the dense stand of thistles standing alone, an army whose fortifications had been stripped away. By the morning of the 3rd day, the easy food was gone. The sheep were restless. They bleated. They paced the fence line. They were hungry. Arthur was there at dawn to see it. He sat on an overturned bucket, a thermos of coffee in his hand. The sun was just clearing the eastern ridgeline. A big, older ewe, clearly the leader of the flock, approached a tall thistle. She sniffed at its spiny leaves, then backed away. She circled it. She tried again. Then, with a delicate, precise movement, she stretched her neck and used her mobile lips and teeth to nibble off the purple flower at the very top of the stalk. She chewed it, her jaw moving from side to side. She swallowed. She paused as if considering. Then she moved to the next thistle and repeated the process, taking only the blossom. Within an hour, a half-dozen other sheep were copying her. A wave of learning was passing through the flock. They moved through the paddock, methodically deflowering the thistles. It was a strange, delicate harvest. They were eating the part of the plant that contained the most sugar, the most energy, and, crucially, the future of the thistle population in the form of seeds. By noon, the purple haze that had covered the paddock was gone. The field was still green with thistle stalks, but its reproductive capacity had been nullified. Arthur allowed himself a small, internal nod of satisfaction. The first step was complete. He spent the rest of the day in the shade of a large oak tree, simply observing. He was studying his tools, learning their habits, their hierarchy, their language of bleats and postures. He was not a shepherd by trade, but he was a student of animals, and he learned quickly. The following week was a slow, grinding battle of attrition. Having eaten the flowers, the hungry sheep began to attack the leaves. They started at the top, where the new growth was tenderest and the spines less formidable. They would strip the upper third of the stalk bare. Deprived of its flowers and a significant portion of its leaves, the thistle plant was forced to draw on the energy reserves in its roots to survive and attempt to regrow. This was the core of his father's strategy, forcing the plant to spend its wealth. At the end of the week, Arthur moved them. He took down the temporary cross fence and set it up on the next 2-acre plot. He opened the way, and the sheep, eager for fresh forage, trotted into the new paddock. Behind them, they left a landscape of devastation. The first paddock was trampled, manured, and grazed down to a uniform stubble of thistle stalks, 6 to 8 inches high. To a casual observer, it looked worse than before. It looked like a wasteland. But Arthur saw something else. He saw a field where the thistle's energy budget had just taken a massive, debilitating hit. He saw the beginning of its bankruptcy. This became the rhythm of his summer. Every week, he moved the fence and the water trough. He spent his days watching the sheep, checking the fence, ensuring the charger was ticking away. He walked the grazed paddocks, studying the thistle's response. The plants sent up new, weaker shoots from their depleted roots. The leaves were smaller, the stalks thinner. The flock would move on, and behind them, the process of exhaustion continued. The first undeniable signs of success were subtle. They were not visible from the road. You had to walk the land to see them. By early August, after the sheep had rotated through the first 10 acres, Arthur walked back to the first paddock. The thistle regrowth was weak and patchy. More importantly, something else was happening. With the dense canopy of thistle leaves gone, sunlight was reaching the soil for the first time in years. The dormant seeds of grass and clover, long suppressed, were beginning to germinate. A faint green fuzz was visible between the brown, dying thistle stalks. The land was breathing again. He knelt and dug into the soil with his pocket knife. He unearthed a thistle rhizome. In a healthy plant, these roots were thick, white, and full of starchy energy. This one was thin and yellowish, and it felt limp between his fingers. He cut it open. It was not the solid, vigorous root of a conqueror. It was the spent, hollowed-out root of a plant that was starving to death. The quiet siege was working. The fortress was collapsing from within. Section. Dale Harding's job required him to cover all corners of the county. In late August, he had a meeting with a dairy farmer whose property bordered Arthur's on the far side of the North 40. As he was leaving the farmer's lane, he decided to drive the long way around, past Arthurcroft Place. Curiosity, or perhaps a lingering sense of professional responsibility, made him do it. He wanted to see the final state of the old man's folly. He slowed his truck as the North 40 came into view. From a distance, it looked brown and beaten down, just as he expected. But as he got closer, he saw that the uniform sea of thistles was gone. The field was a patchwork of different stages of grazing. In the most recently grazed section, the sheep were still visible, a knot of white against the green. In the sections they had left weeks ago, the landscape was transformed. The towering, 6-foot-tall thistles were gone. In their place was a low, brownish-green stubble. He stopped the truck and got out, something pulling him toward the fence for a closer look. He leaned over the wire, his eyes scanning the first paddock that had been grazed back in July. He had expected to see a vigorous regrowth of thistle, a testament to the plant's resilience. He saw almost none. Instead, he saw grass, a surprising amount of it. It wasn't a perfect stand of hay, but it was a pasture dotted with the withered brown stalks of defeated thistles. He looked at the next paddock and the next. The pattern was the same. A wave of destruction for the thistles had been followed by a wave of recovery for the grasses. He was a man of science. He understood the principles of photosynthesis, of root reserves, of plant competition. What he was seeing should not have been possible. The sheep should have merely trimmed the tops of the plants, an insignificant pruning that the massive root system would have easily overcome. But the evidence before him was undeniable. The relentless, concentrated grazing had done something he had thought only a powerful systemic herbicide could accomplish. It had exhausted the roots. He stood there for a long time, his clipboard forgotten on the seat of his truck. The neat columns of his cost-benefit analysis, the application rates, the chemical names, they all seemed suddenly abstract and inadequate. He was looking at a 40-acre refutation of his entire education. He felt a profound sense of cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable feeling of a deeply held belief crumbling in the face of contradictory evidence. He was not just looking at a field. He was looking at the limit of his own knowledge. He got back in his truck, his professional certainty shaken to its core. By the end of September, the sheep had grazed their way across the entire 40 acres. Their work was done for the season. Arthur moved them to a different pasture, one with a good stand of late-season grass, to fatten them up before winter. He then turned his attention back to the North 40. The field was a stubble of dying thistle stalks and burgeoning new grass. It was time for the final step. He fired up the old John Deere 4020. The diesel engine caught with a familiar, reassuring clatter. He hitched up a heavy disc harrow, its steel blade sharpened and ready. He drove the tractor into the North 40, the machine that had sat idle all summer while the sheep did their work. He lowered the disc, and it bit into the soil. The ground was softer than he had felt it in years, loosened by the dying thistle roots and enriched by the manure of the sheep. He spent 2 days disking the entire field, turning the stubble and the new grass under, preparing a seedbed. The work was smooth, the tractor pulling easily through the now-tamed soil. There was no need to fight the land. It was ready. He finished the job by planting a cover crop. He filled the grain drill with winter rye seed and traced the field back and forth in long, straight lines. The rye would grow quickly in the cool autumn weather, its roots holding the soil in place over the winter, its growth choking out any last, desperate attempts by the few surviving thistle roots to send up shoots. It was the final act in the long, slow process of healing the land. As he drove the tractor back to the barn in the fading light of a crisp September evening, he felt a quiet, bone-deep satisfaction. The work was done. The success was quantified not in a single, dramatic moment, but in the slow, undeniable unfolding of the following spring. The winter rye grew thick and lush. Arthur grazed it lightly with his cattle in April, then let it grow. When he cut it for hay in late May, the yield was staggering. He got nearly 2 tons to the acre from a field that had been declared a total loss less than a year before. More importantly, the thistles were gone. Here and there, a solitary, spindly plant emerged, a refugee from the old regime, but it was easily dispatched with a hoe. There was no army, no interconnected fortress beneath the soil. The monoculture had been broken. The financial calculation was stark. Dale Harding's proposed chemical solution would have cost Arthur Croft $6,000 in the first year alone, with no guarantee of a usable crop. The field would have been fallow, its soil chemistry altered by repeated doses of poison. Arthur's solution had cost him the price of 62 sheep and some used fencing materials. He had spent his own labor, but he had spent almost no cash. And now, he had a flock of sheep that had not only cleared his field, but had also produced a crop of lambs. He could sell the lambs and some of the older ewes for more than his initial investment. The sheep were not a cost. They were a productive asset. He had not spent $6,000. He had, in effect, been paid to solve his own problem. The math did not require pencil. It was a simple, elegant equation of ecological and economic health. One afternoon in early June, exactly 1 year after his first visit, Dale Harding's Ford Ranger pulled into Arthur Croft's lane. It moved slowly, hesitantly, as if the driver were unsure of his welcome. Dale got out. He was not wearing his university polo shirt, but a simple work shirt. He held his hat in his hands, turning it over and over. He looked different. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a look of humility. Arthur saw him from a barn and walked out to meet him. He waited, saying nothing. Dale stopped a few feet away. He looked past Arthur at the North 40, which was now a field of vibrant green, the second cutting of hay already growing thick and strong. He looked down at his boots, then back up at Arthur's face. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice quiet and clear, "I came to say that I was wrong. I was wrong about this field. I drive by it every week, and I still can't quite believe it. I've never seen anything like it. What you did here. My books, my professors. They never mentioned anything like it." The admission hung in the air, a simple, direct acknowledgement of his error. There was no excuse, no attempt to justify his earlier position. It was a complete and honest concession. Arthur Croft did not smile. He did not gloat. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a quiet acceptance. Vindication was not a victory to be celebrated, but a truth to be affirmed. "My father taught me," he said, by way of explanation. He gestured for Dale to follow him. He led him not to the field, but to the porch. He went inside and came back with a small, leather-bound notebook. He handed it to the young man. Dale took the book with a reverence usually reserved for a historical document. He opened its delicate pages and saw the faded cursive, the careful notes, the hand-drawn diagrams of paddock rotations. Arthur stood beside him and explained the principle, his words as spare and functional as his father's had been. "You don't kill the root," he said. "You make the root kill itself. You use the animal's hunger and the plant's own will to grow. You just guide the process. The work gets done. The land gets better. He pointed to a passage in the notebook. He wrote it all down. He watched. He paid attention. That's the main thing. Paying attention. Dale spent an hour on that porch, reading through the notebook. It was a revelation. It was a body of knowledge as rigorous and as evidence-based as any university study. Yet it was grounded in a different kind of science, the science of place, of patient observation, of generational memory. He saw that what Arthur had done was not an act of folk magic, but a sophisticated application of ecological principles. He had manipulated grazing pressure, plant competition, and nutrient cycling to achieve a desired outcome. It was just that his tools were sheep and time, not nozzles and chemicals. When he finally handed the notebook back, he was a changed man. The rigid framework of his formal education had been permanently expanded. "Thank you," he said to Arthur. "Thank you for showing me this." The knowledge did not remain on Arthur's farm. Dale Harding, humbled and inspired, began to change his own methods. He couldn't rewrite the official pamphlets from the state university, but he could change how he spoke to farmers. He started a small, unofficial program at the extension office, which he called Alternative Pasture Restoration Strategies. He began seeking out other old-timers, asking them about how they had solved problems before the age of chemical dependency. He collected their stories, their wisdom. When farmers called him with problems like Arthur's, he would first present the official chemical solution, as his job required. But then he would pause and say, "Now, there's another way. It takes more time. It takes a different kind of management. But I know a man who cleared 40 acres of Canada thistle with a flock of sheep." He began to incorporate Arthur's story, always anonymously, into his presentations. He was no longer just an agent of a university. He had become a bridge between two worlds of knowledge. The single lesson learned in a thistle field began to ripple outwards, quietly influencing the agriculture of the entire county. Years passed. The flock of Scottish blackface sheep became a permanent and defining feature of the Croft farm. They were no longer just a tool for a specific problem. They were an integral part of the farm's ecosystem. Their grazing maintained the health of the pastures. Their manure fertilized the soil, and their lambs provided a steady source of income. They were a living symbol of a solution that worked with nature, not against it. The sight of the hardy, horned sheep grazing peacefully on the hills became a familiar and respected part of the local landscape. The North 40 was no longer Arthur's thistle patch. It was simply the North 40, one of the most productive hayfields in the area. Its history became a piece of local lore, a story told to new farmers, a legend of how the old man had outsmarted the weed that no one else could kill. The field's very ordinariness was the ultimate proof of Arthur's success. It was no longer remarkable. It was simply a healthy, functioning piece of land, its past trauma healed, its balance restored. The new normal was a quiet, green testament to the power of a forgotten idea. One cool evening in late summer, nearly a decade after the thistles had been conquered, Arthur walked the fence line of the North 40. He was older now, his steps slower, but his eyes were just as sharp. He was not alone. His grandson, Leo, walked beside him. Leo was 16, a tall, quiet boy who had spent his summers on the farm, learning its rhythms. He had heard the story of the thistles many times, but now his grandfather was explaining it in a new way. Arthur carried the old leather-bound notebook. He stopped and opened it, showing Leo his great-grandfather's faded handwriting. "This is more than just a story," Arthur said, his voice raspy with age. "It's a way of thinking. Your great-grandfather didn't see the thistles as an enemy to be killed. He saw them as a part of the system that was out of balance. He understood that the problem wasn't the plant. The problem was the condition that allowed the plant to take over." He pointed out at the lush field. He knew that if you fixed the condition, the problem would fix itself. The sheep didn't just eat the thistles. They changed the conditions. They put pressure on the weed, and they fertilized the grass. They helped the good plants outcompete the bad ones. That's the lesson. It's not about what you fight. It's about what you encourage. He closed the book and handed it to the boy. "This is yours now," he said. There's more in there than just how to handle thistles. There's a lifetime of paying attention in those pages. Don't ever think that what's new is always what's best. And don't ever think that a problem is unsolvable just because the official answer doesn't work. Leo took the book. He felt the worn leather, the weight of the knowledge inside it. He looked from his grandfather's weathered face to the healthy, peaceful field, and for the first time, he understood. He was not just inheriting a farm. He was inheriting a way of seeing, a legacy of patience and wisdom. The torch was being passed, not in a grand ceremony, but in a quiet moment by a fence row, as it had been for generations. Some problems are not meant to be defeated in a single, violent battle, but to be outlasted over a season. The land kept its own time, a slow, patient rhythm of growth and decay, of struggle and recovery. It did not reward brute force or frantic haste. It rewarded those who were willing to listen, to observe, and to align their work with its ancient and enduring logic. Some things do not become obsolete. They just wait, quietly, for people to remember why they work.